There is a sound you either know instantly or have never heard. A dial tone, a burst of tones, then 20 seconds of two machines screaming at each other. If you know it, you know what came with it. Nobody else in the house could use the telephone, and somebody always picked it up anyway. That noise was the front door of an internet that existed for roughly 15 years before the web. It started in a Chicago basement in February 1978 during a blizzard. Almost nothing of it survives as pictures. There are no screenshots because there was nothing to screenshot with. It is the least photographed decade in computing, but you use its inventions every day. Threads, moderators, downloading a file in pieces so one failure does not cost you the whole thing. Spam. All of it was solved here first. In the next half hour, how that world worked, who paid for it out of their own telephone bills, and which of its problems we have never solved. Before anything else, get the geography right, because almost every retelling of this gets it wrong in exactly the same way. And once it is wrong, nothing that follows makes sense. There was no single network. There were thousands of separate machines, each with a telephone number, each run by one person, and mostly they did not talk to each other at all. You did not go online, you dial the place, one place, and when you were done you hung up, and it was gone until you dialed it again. That distinction is not pedantry, it is the whole architecture. Every assumption you have about being connected is an assumption about being connected continuously, and that did not exist yet. A message you sent might sit on a machine for a day before anybody read it, and might take another 2 days to reach a machine in the next country. So the software had to be built for absence. It assumed the other end was usually not there, and that everything worthwhile happened in the gaps between connections. The second thing to fix in your head is the money. Local calls were cheap or free. Calls to another city were metered by the minute, and they were not cheap. Which means the map of this world was not a map of who wanted to talk to whom. It was a map of telephone tariffs, and it shaped the culture completely. A machine in your own dialing area was a place you could visit every evening. A machine 300 miles away was a decision with a cost, and you rehearsed what you would do there. People kept their sessions short because sessions were expensive. They wrote messages offline, dialed, sent everything at once, took everything waiting, and hung up. If you have ever wondered why the etiquette of the early internet was so severe about wasting other people's time, that is the reason. It was not a metaphor. There was a meter running. And the third thing is scarcity of the machine itself. One telephone line meant one caller. Not one at a time per page. One caller, full stop on the entire system. Everybody else got a busy signal. So you dialed again and again. Some people wrote out the number on a card and worked through it for an hour to get in. Now hold those three facts together. No continuous connection, metered distance, one person at a time, and the rest of this episode explains itself. In January 1978, a blizzard came across the American Midwest and dumped record snow on Chicago. Roads closed, offices closed, and people stayed in their houses for days with nothing much to do. Two of the people stuck at home were Ward Christensen and Randy Suess. They knew each other from a hobbyist group called the Chicago Area Computer Hobbyists Exchange. The group had a problem that sounds trivial and was not. How do you tell 40 people that a meeting has moved when the only tools you have are the telephone and the post? You ring 40 people, or you post 40 letters and hope. There was no third option, and the group had wanted one for a while. What they wanted was a physical corkboard, the kind in a laundrette, but reachable by telephone. Somewhere you pin a note and other people come and read it whenever they like. That is the entire specification. It is also, if you look at it directly, the specification of essentially every online forum built in the 50 years since. The blizzard gave them the uninterrupted days. Christensen wrote the software. Suess put together the hardware, an early hobbyist machine assembled from boards. It went online on the 16th of February, 1978. They called it a computerized bulletin board system, which is where the name and the 4-letter abbreviation come from. They had a working version in about 2 weeks, and here is my favorite detail in this entire episode because it is so recognizably human. They told people it had taken 4. They did not want it to look rushed. 2 men invent an entire category of software in a fortnight and then pad the schedule so it will be taken seriously. Some things about engineering have never changed at all. Christensen was the software half of the pair, and he had already written the other thing this world could not have run without a year earlier in 1977. We will come back to that, because it deserves its own act, and because almost nobody knows his name in connection with it either. He died in October 2024 at 78. The obituaries had to explain to a general audience what a bulletin board system was, which is a strange thing to have to explain about a man who built the room that several million people spent their evenings in. Randy Suess died a few years earlier. Neither of them ever made significant money from it, and as far as I can tell, neither of them expected to. So what was it actually like to be on one of these? Because the mechanics decided the culture, and the culture is the part that survived. You dialed. If you were lucky, the machine answered and you got a menu, not a page. A menu drawn out of ordinary characters, one screen at a time. Read messages, leave a message, see who else has been here, look at what files are available. That was usually the whole thing. And behind it was one person whose machine it was, who had bought the telephone line and who was almost always awake in the next room. They were called the system operator, which everybody shortened to sysop, and the word carried a kind of weight that no modern job title reproduces because it described an owner rather than a role. Because this person was not a moderator applying a policy written by somebody else. This was their machine, in their house, on their telephone bill. They wrote the rules, they enforced the rules, they decided who got an account and who lost one, and there was no appeal, because there was nobody to appeal to. That sounds authoritarian, and in a sense it was. But it had a property our current arrangement does not have, and it is worth naming precisely. The person making the decision was reachable, was one identifiable human being, and was carrying the cost of the thing personally, all three at once. If you thought a decision was unfair, you could say so to them, and they would answer, because there were 40 of you and one of them and they knew your voice. And if you disliked it enough, you left and dialed another number. The barrier to starting a competitor was a spare machine and a second telephone line. So the whole landscape was thousands of tiny, absolutely governed kingdoms, and exit was cheap. That combination is not one we have anywhere on the internet today. The other thing that single telephone line produced, without anybody designing it, was patience. Since only one person could be connected at a time, a conversation took days by definition rather than by choice. You wrote something, you hung up. Somebody dialed in that evening and read it, they reply. You read the reply the next day. Nothing about that is efficient. But an argument conducted at one exchange a day is a different animal from an argument conducted at one exchange a second. People had time to reconsider before they answered, and quite often, the answer they sent was not the one they had drafted the night before. Now the invention that made all of it more than a message board, and the reason Ward Christensen's name should be better known than it is. Sending text down a telephone line is forgiving. If a character arrives wrong, you can usually see what it was meant to be and read on. Sending a program down a telephone line is not forgiving at all. One wrong byte in 10,000 and the thing does not run and nothing tells you which byte it was. And telephone lines in 1977 were full of small electrical events. A click on the line was a corrupted byte, and clicks were normal. So the problem was not speed. The problem was that the medium was unreliable in a way the cargo could not tolerate, and everybody knew it. Christensen's answer in 1977 is a design pattern you have personally relied on 1,000 times this year alone without ever knowing that it had an origin, or a date, or an author. Do not send the file. Cut it into small blocks. Send one block. Have the far end check it and say yes or no. If yes, send the next. If no, send that block again. The whole file never has to be right. Only the current small piece has to be right, and any piece can be retried without touching the rest. He called it XMODEM. It is about as much protocol as you can have and still have one, and it turned an unreliable line into a reliable one, at the cost of some waiting. And that idea, cut it up, verify each piece, retry only the piece that broke, is now underneath essentially everything that moves data anywhere, on any network, at any scale. It is how the video you are watching arrives. It is how a large upload survives a lift. It is why a download that stalls at 90% can pick up rather than start again. One man, 1 year, one idea that is completely obvious in hindsight and was obvious to nobody at the time, and out of it the entire practice of moving data across something that might break in the middle. What it produced immediately was the file area. A bulletin board was no longer only a place to leave notes, it was a place to fetch things. And a place to fetch things is a place with a queue, and a place with a queue is a place with a social order. Who is allowed to take, and on what terms? Meanwhile, at two universities a few miles apart in North Carolina, a different group of people was working on a problem the bulletin boards could not solve at all, and structurally never could. The bulletin board had one fundamental limit. Everything on it was on it. If the conversation was on a machine in Chicago and you were not, it may as well not exist. In 1979, two graduate students at Duke University, Tom Truscott and Jim Ellis, worked out what to do about that. Their idea was to stop moving people to the conversation and start moving the conversation to the people. Copy the messages themselves from machine to machine overnight. Steve Bellovin, then at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, wrote the first working version. It was about 3 pages of shell script. 3 pages. And it worked because it wrote something that was already installed and already free, a Unix utility for copying files between machines over a modem. That is the detail that made the whole thing spread, and I want to be blunt about it. There was no funding, no company, and no permission. Any site that already had Unix already had the transport. Joining cost you a telephone call to one existing site and somebody's agreement to keep making it. They announced it at a conference in January 1980 in Boulder, Colorado. The first traffic ran between Duke and Chapel Hill, 2 machines, a few messages a day. The original software was called A News. When volume outgrew it, others rewrote it as B News, and that pattern repeated for 20 years. Now the mechanism itself, because it is the strangest part of the whole story, it is not how anything works today, and it explains both of the disasters in the last 2 acts. There was no central copy. A message was handed to your neighboring machine, which handed it to its neighbors, which handed it on, until it had reached everywhere. Every participating site stored the entire conversation. All of it. Not a link to it, not a cache of it, its own complete copy. So there was nothing to switch off. There was no company, no server to seize, no address that mattered more than any other address. Deleting a message from the network was not difficult. It was meaningless, because by the time you asked, several hundred machines already had it. Hold on to that, because it explains everything that happens in the last 2 acts of this episode, and both of those things happened to it rather than because of it. What that network invented, more than any piece of software, was the shape of an online conversation. The shape you are looking at right now, wherever you are reading. First, the group. Messages went into named channels, arranged as a hierarchy so a site could carry the ones it wanted and refuse the rest. That is a subscription model, and it was invented because bandwidth was scarce. A small site could not take everything, so it chose. Every feed you follow is a descendant of that constraint. Second, the thread. A reply carried a reference to the message it answered, so software could reconstruct a branching conversation out of a flat pile of messages. Every threaded comment section you have ever read is that idea, unchanged. Nobody has improved on it in 45 years. A good number of modern systems are a distinctly worse implementation of it. Third, the crosspost. One message could be filed in several groups at once while remaining one message, so people reading 2 groups saw it once. Remember that, because in the last act, somebody works out that if you do the opposite deliberately, you can be everywhere at once. That is the invention of spam, and it is a distinction of one word. Fourth, governance without a governor. Creating a new group required a discussion and a vote among the people who would have to carry it. That was slow and argumentative, and it worked, roughly, for a while. Then in 1987, the whole hierarchy was reorganized, and a group of people objected to what the reorganization excluded. So they made a parallel hierarchy with no vote at all. Anyone could create a group in it, for anything, and the ordinary channels of approval did not apply. It was called Alt, and it became, predictably and immediately, both the most interesting and the most disreputable part of the network, which is the oldest result in this entire field. Build a moderated commons and an unmoderated one beside it, and watch which one grows faster and what grows in it. Fifth, and least visible, the signature and the quoted reply. Both conventions were argued into existence, at length, by people who had to pay to download the argument. There were long, genuinely bitter disputes about how many lines of somebody else's message you were entitled to quote before replying to it. That sounds absurd until you remember that every quoted line was transmitted to every site on Earth, and somebody was paying for the call at each hop. So the etiquette was not politeness, it was cost control, dressed as manners, and it hardened into culture and outlived the cost by 30 years. Now put the two halves together, because somebody did, and the result is the most impressive piece of amateur engineering in this story. The bulletin boards had the people, ordinary people at home on ordinary machines. The university network had the mechanism for moving a conversation between sites. But the boards could not use that mechanism. It rode Unix, and there was no Unix in anybody's spare room. There were home computers with one telephone line and a modem. In 1983, Tom Jennings in San Francisco wrote bulletin board software of his own and called it Fido. In 1984, he added the part that mattered. He made two of them telephone each other, automatically, in the middle of the night, when long-distance rates were at their lowest. A machine would wake at a set hour, dial another machine hundreds of miles away, exchange bundles of messages, hang up, and be a normal bulletin board again by breakfast. The first test had two nodes, Jennings in San Francisco and one other machine in Baltimore. By that August, there were about 30. By September, 50. By January the following year, more than 160. The network took its name from the software and was called FidoNet. Nobody was selling it. It spread because each new person wanted to be reachable by the people already on it. And the mechanism is one that predates computing entirely. Nothing is ever connected to anything. Messages are bundled, carried one hop, unbundled, resorted, rebundled, carried again. It is a postal service, built out of modems, running at night, on volunteers' telephone bills, with no company and no employees anywhere in it. Which raises the question that decides whether you find this story charming or serious. Who paid for it? The answer is that individual people did, out of their own money, for years, so that strangers could talk to other strangers. There are accounts from that period of household arguments about telephone bills that ran to hundreds of dollars a month, for a network the person paying did not own and could not sell. By 1996, the Nautilus, the shared file that recorded every participating machine, its number and its operator, carried 34,038 entries in it. 34,000 privately owned computers in a great many countries, passing messages to each other every night by arrangement, with nothing at the center. Estimates of the true peak vary quite a bit between sources, so I will not give you one. The Nautilus figure is a count of a file, and it is the number I can stand behind. So this was a real place with real infrastructure, and by the start of the 90s, a very large number of technical people lived in it. Which is why, when two things arrived that would rearrange the next 40 years, they arrived here and almost nowhere else, and in the same 3 weeks. On the 6th of August 1991, a researcher at a physics laboratory in Switzerland posted to a small group devoted to hypertext. He described a project for linking documents across machines, listed the software he had written, and invited anybody interested to try it. The post is still archived, and you can read it. That was Tim Berners-Lee, and the project was the World Wide Web. Its public announcement was a message in a discussion group, sent to people who mostly did not reply. 19 days later, on the 25th of August, a 21-year-old student in Finland posted to a group about a small teaching operating system. His subject line was a question, "What would you like to see most?" His message said he was writing a free operating system and that it was just a hobby. He added that it would not be big and professional. That was Linus Torvalds, and the hobby is now underneath most of the servers on Earth and inside most of the phones. 19 days apart. The same medium. Neither announcement was a launch or an event or a press release. They were messages posted into a room hoping somebody was interested. And I want to be careful not to make that sound mystical, because the reason is mechanical and it is the point of this whole episode. There was nowhere else. If you had built something and wanted competent strangers to look at it, that network was the only place where competent strangers were gathered and reachable. No search engine existed to find you. No web existed to host you. The list of places to stand and say, "I have made a thing," had one entry on it. Which makes the older network the delivery mechanism for its own replacement. It carried the announcement of the web, and the web took its audience within about 5 years. There is no bitterness in that. It is just what happens when a general purpose meeting place works. The meeting place is where the thing that replaces it gets introduced. Both posts are still readable today, which is the direct consequence of that store. Everything everywhere designed from Act 6. Nothing had to be preserved, it simply could not be removed. A message from 1991 survives because several hundred independent machines each kept their own copy, and some of their operators never threw anything away. Now, the part that people who were there still talk about, and it starts with something that had been a harmless annual joke. Because most of the early network ran through universities, its population changed on an academic timetable. Every September, a new intake of students got access for the first time. And every September, the same thing happened. A wave of people arrived who did not know the conventions, asked things that had been answered 100 times, and were told so, at length. Then, by about October, they had learned the local customs, and the network went back to normal until the following year. It was a season. People complained about it, the way people complain about weather. Then commercial providers began selling access to the general public, and the intake stopped being seasonal because the general public does not have a term timetable. In January 1994, somebody named Dave Fisher wrote a line in a group about computing folklore that has outlived every other sentence written about this. He wrote that September 1993 would go down in history as the September that never ended. And I want to correct the version of this you've probably heard, because it is repeated constantly with the wrong villain and the wrong date. The date most often given is September 1993, and it is attached to one particular company. That company's own gateway to the network did not open until March 1994. So the phrase was coined about a general commercial influx and then attached afterwards to the single most visible arrival, which is how most origin stories go wrong. What is true, and is the part worth keeping, is the structural observation underneath it. A culture that transmits itself by correction can only absorb newcomers at a certain rate. If people arrive faster than the existing population can teach them, the teaching stops working, and the people doing the teaching stop trying, and then leave. That is not a complaint about newcomers. It is a claim about a ratio, and it is testable. And every online community since has run the same experiment and got the same answer. Every forum you've watched decline, every group chat that stopped being good when it got big is the same arithmetic in different clothes. The old network did not have a solution. It had per-group volunteers and a strong tradition of pointing at documents. Both of those scale linearly, and arrivals did not. Nobody has solved it since either. What we have instead is automated enforcement and a much lower expectation that a newcomer will be taught anything at all. And then, 3 months after that sentence was written, somebody worked out what the architecture would permit if you simply did not care. On the 12th of April 1994, 2 immigration lawyers working in Phoenix, Arizona, posted an advertisement for their own professional services onto the network. The subject line offered help with a lottery for residency permits. That is the entire product. It was, on its own terms, a legal service somebody might want. What made it the beginning of something was not the content. It was one technical decision, and it is exactly the distinction I flagged in Act 7. What? The polite mechanism, the crosspost, files one message in many groups, one copy. A reader who follows 5 of those groups sees it once and can dismiss it once. They did not do that. They posted it separately into each group and to at least 5,500 of them. So it was not one message in many places, it was thousands of individual messages, and every reader saw it again and again and again in every room they entered. The network's own design then did the rest, faithfully, because that is what it was built to do. Every one of those copies was propagated to every site on Earth. And there was no way to recall it for the exact reason that had been the network's greatest strength for 15 years. No center, no owner, no delete. The response was immediate and enormous, and it arrived at the only address anybody could find, the small company that provided the two lawyers' connection. That company's mail systems crashed repeatedly over the following days, purely under the weight of the complaints arriving about somebody else's advertisement, and it terminated the account. Notice who paid, not the senders, their provider, and every site operator whose disk filled up, and every reader who downloaded 5,000 copies of the same advertisement at their own expense. That is the economics of spam, fully formed on day one. The sender's cost is near zero, and the cost of receiving is spread across everybody else. Nothing about that has changed in 30 years. Every filter and every reputation system since is an attempt to put some costs back on the sender, and none of them has managed it properly. So the network did not die of spam or of newcomers, and it is worth being accurate about how it actually ended, because it is not dramatic. The web arrived, and it was better at almost everything an ordinary person wanted. It had pictures. It did not require you to understand a hierarchy. You could arrive at one page and leave. The bulletin boards emptied because the same telephone line now reached everywhere instead of one place, and nobody was going to keep dialing one house when that was true. Both survive in small form to this day, and both are still carrying traffic, which is a peculiar afterlife for something everyone describes in the past tense. So, 4 things to take away, and none of them are nostalgia, because I promised you at the start that this would not be that. 1. When something has no center, nobody can switch it off and nobody can take anything down. Those are the same property, and you do not get to choose which half you receive. That is the trade every decentralized system offers, today included. If you are ever sold 1 on the resilience alone, you are being sold half of a sentence. 2. Look at what a system makes cheap and what it makes expensive, and you can predict its culture before you meet anybody in it. Metered calls produce brevity and offline drafting. Free, unlimited posting produced the opposite. The manners followed the meter, not the other way around. 3. A community that transmits its rules by correcting people has a maximum intake rate. Compare arrivals to the number of people willing to teach, and you can see trouble coming a year out. That is a genuinely useful thing to hold if you run any group at all, online or not, and it costs nothing to check. 4, and the practical one. Chunk it, check each chunk, retry only what broke. Christensen's 1977 idea is still the right answer to any unreliable channel. It works for file transfers, for long tasks, for anything you have to do over a connection that might drop, and for a surprising amount of work that has no computer in it at all. Next week on Dark History of the Internet, we go back before all of this, to the first programs that copied themselves from one machine to another, and to the argument about whether the first one was even hostile. Creeper, Elk Cloner, and Brain. One was an experiment. One was written by a teenager as a joke, and one had its author's real address printed inside it. Follow the channel, and I will see you then.